Well, it's good to see you. Thanks for coming, Victorville, over in Apple Valley and Phelan at our other campuses. We're delighted to have you all here. If you did not get a copy of the outline, raise your hand. We'll provide that for you. We've got a lot of ground to cover today as we try to tell you the story of Nehemiah, at least most of the story in one setting. So prepare yourself, strap in for that. It's gonna be a fun ride, I trust, at least helpful. Before we get to the passage today, though, I wanted to let you all know a couple of things. First of all, that Pastor Scott Thibodeau has resigned as a member of our pastoral team. He and Pam will be stepping away from ministry to focus on some personal and family growth issues. We trust and believe that at some point in the future they'll be ready to re-engage the kind of fruitful ministry that they both have enjoyed for so many years, and so we are supporting them during this time of transition, and I would ask for your prayers on their behalf and for your encouragement to them as well. We're all fortunate to know them as friends and have been blessed to share ministry with them for the past 6.5 years. So that's a change in some of the things going on here on our campus at HTC. I also wanted to give you an update on my friend Skip, who I shared last weekend, had an accident, was airlifted down to Loma Linda University Medical Center, and many of you know Skip, and he's home now, home with a little h, not home to be with the Lord. Thankfully, that's not what the Lord's plan for him was, although it came very close to that. He actually suffered the injury that Christopher Reeve suffered years ago, and that was in the media. Many of us followed that post-fall evolution of his treatment and his eventual demise physically and his death. Thankfully, that did not occur with Skip. I told him this past week I was thankful I didn't have to conduct a service, number one, for him, a memorial service, but he also has complete use of all of his fingers and toes and arms and legs, and so that is a miracle. In fact, every time another doctor paraded through his room this week and looked at his charts, they reminded him as to how fortunate he was that he's still functioning completely. And so in fact, they told him he would return to normal. I told him if he's ever normal, that'll be the first time. But that's just because such a dear friend, and we're blessed with his progress. I wanted to give you an update because I shared that last time. Well, this is a series about leadership, and we've reminded you throughout the entire series that we're all leaders. We may never be handed a microphone. Most of us might never be asked to ascend to the top of a podium or to take a stage, but the greatest leaders in the world don't need any of those things. If you never lead anywhere else in your life, the most important leadership position that we all have is the leading of the oikos that God has given us, to shepherd that flock of people on their spiritual journey. God has given us all 8 to 15, supernaturally and strategically placed them in our spheres of influence, in our relational worlds, because He wants us to lead them on that journey, either to Christ or even with Christ, as we encourage them along the way. Every time we've come to one of the kings, and some of the individuals that have been on this list are not kings per se, but they all teach us something about leadership, and we've been elevating different aspects of their particular gift set, the strengths that they bring to the table in their leadership roles. And today, as we look at the life of Nehemiah, the idea that we see in his life so clearly portrayed, among other things, I might add, but this one is what we're focusing on today, and that is that he has this attribute of discernment, the ability to see through the smoke in a crisis, to actually put his finger on exactly what the problem is, and then to contribute all of those energies and resources that are necessary to solve the problem. And when we or people we lead seem to be spinning our wheels or spinning their wheels, that ability to see exactly where they need to go and what they need to do is one of the attributes of leadership that Nehemiah brings so clearly into focus. And so we'll be looking in Nehemiah chapter 1. If you have your Bibles, you can turn there. Let me just bring you up to speed as to what has been happening in our journey on Route 66. We've been reading through the Bible. I hope that you're continuing. Some of you have fallen off the wagon. I understand how that works. It has been a long journey even to this point. In fact, some of the passages we've looked at have been, let's be honest, rather boring to the average reader. They don't see maybe some of the things there that would be able to keep their attention or prompt their attention in those sections. And so maybe you've been among that group that have found it difficult to sustain your reading schedule. I would encourage you to jump on board now, because it's going to start lighten up this week again. In fact, if you want to begin with the book of Ezra, look on our website, heidelschurch.com, check out the check out the reading schedule and pick up Ezra. And then Esther. The story of Nehemiah we'll see today, and then Esther, one of the greatest stories in literature, in my opinion. And so I think you'll be glad you did just by taking that on-ramp this week once again and rejoining the process. But we've seen that the nation of Israel has had, some bumps lately in our reading, in fact, for months. This story, the story of Nehemiah, takes place roughly 2,500 years ago during a time in Israel's history known as the exile. Now, back in her glory years, Israel consisted of 12 tribes, and they were led, all 12 tribes together, led by 3 different kings. By Saul, Israel's first king, David, the second king, and David's son, Solomon, king number 3. But those are the only kings that reigned during that United Kingdom phase. In the year 931 BC, Israel experienced what could best be described, I think, as a messy divorce. And the 10 northern tribes pulled away from the 2 southern tribes. 10 northern tribes maintained the name Israel, the kingdom of Israel, and the 2 southern tribes then became known as Judah. Now, later on this fall, we're going to begin reading the New Testament, and we're going to see in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that there is really still an attitude of resentment between the North and the South. And we see down in the southern brothers, down in the Judea, Jerusalem area, have this, aristocratic kind of arrogant attitude toward their less spiritual brothers in the northern Galilee district, which is one of the real problems why Jesus was always butting heads with those guys down in Jerusalem, because Jesus was a northerner. And these guys in Jerusalem were southern. Well, we'll see that later. I don't want to talk too much about it today. We don't have time. But this attitude between the North and the South actually began during this divided kingdom phase, as they were calling each other out and calling each other names. And you've been reading about even the wars that they had against one another. Well, the northern kingdom of Israel were carried away into exile by the Assyrians after 200 years of disobedience. Virtually no godly leadership. God said enough is enough. The Assyrians came in and wiped them out. And then after 140 more years, it was clear that the 2 southern tribes, nation of Judah, were struggling with many of the same issues. And by that time, the Babylonians had assimilated the Assyrian Empire into their culture. And in the year 614 BC, then General Nebuchadnezzar led a successful Babylonian army against Assyria, and Babylon replaced Assyria as the ruler of the ancient world. And after completely subjugating Assyria and the coalition that the Assyrians had with the Egyptians, he then began to maneuver around to some of those peripheral kingdoms, assimilating them into the Babylonian empire. And one of those peripheral kingdoms was the kingdom of Judah. And so now when we get to the book of Nehemiah, we are looking at Israel in exile. And the story of Nehemiah takes place another 141 years still later. The Babylonians have since been conquered by the Persians. And many of the Jewish people had been allowed under the mercy, I guess you could call the mercy of the Persian king. As God's Spirit began to work in his life, the Persian king allowed different waves of returnees now to return back to Jerusalem. And Zerubbabel is one who returned to rebuild the temple. Ezra, the priest, returned to begin the spiritual services in the temple. But Nehemiah is a typical example of a Jewish guy who's still living in Persia, still living in the capital city of Persia. Never had even known his homeland. Many of the Jews who were living in exile were born in exile. They were still Jewish. They still loved Israel. They still loved their Jewish heritage. They still loved the Jewish God, Yahweh. But they had never been home. And that's one thing we know about Nehemiah. He had never been home to Israel, to Judah, to Jerusalem. We also know he's not a religious professional. He's not like Ezra. He's not a priest. He's just a guy working a job. In fact, essentially, in Persia, he's still a slave. But he's a man of noble character because, as we'll read in a few minutes, he's the king's cupbearer. And the cupbearer meant that any time the king was going to eat or have a beverage, the cupbearer would taste the food or take a drink before the king did to make sure that nobody had slipped some poison in. And so if you had a cupbearer, and all the kings did, he was a guy that you trusted very much. And so we know Nehemiah had integrity. Integrity that was even recognized by the pagan king of Persia. And we also know about Nehemiah. He was a great leader, and we'll see that in the story. And if you've read, we haven't read all of the story of Nehemiah on our little schedule yet, but we've gotten through, most of the book of Nehemiah, and we've been able to see some of the great leadership attributes that he expresses in his role. Well, God, as I mentioned, begins to move in the heart of the Persian king, and many of Nehemiah's brethren are allowed to return home, back to Jerusalem. And when they come back to Persia, they report to Nehemiah that the walls are still in ruins, which is a problem for Nehemiah, because he loves the city of Jerusalem. In fact, when we read the story of Nehemiah, it really isn't a story about a man, even though it's his journal that we read. It's not his story. It's the story of a city. The city of God. The city of Zion. In fact, in the Bible, Jerusalem is the city. Any Jew anywhere in the world, no matter what the elevation, no matter where they might have been positioned on the map, every time they took a trip to Jerusalem, they always went up to Jerusalem. They could be on the top of Mount Everest, and still they would say, we're going up to Jerusalem. It was that highly esteemed in that culture. And because of the love that he had for the city, because of the love that he had for the God whose reputation was taking a hit, because those walls were still down, rebuilding the walls around the city of Jerusalem became the defining element of Nehemiah's life and ministry. You see, the first requirement, this is not in your notes, this is a freebie. Just want you to know I'm taking care of you today. The first requirement of leadership is that a need exists. A need exists. There is something that needs to be resolved. And that's why many of God's leaders have actually led under protest. They didn't show up one day and say, hey, God made me a leader, so what do you guys need me to do for you? It wasn't until a crisis emerged that began to rise above the rest and accept the call of God to lead. And that's even true for us in our lives. It might be a job-related issue, it might be a family-related issue, but all of us have that oikos-related issue where a need exists. People need Jesus. Those who already have Jesus need to grow in Christ. And God calls us to rise up, see, because there's a problem that needs to be resolved. And God's going to resolve the problem, but He calls on us to be involved in that process. Something is broken, and He gives us a passion to fix it. In fact, in chapter 1, look in chapter 1, beginning in verse 3, these guys came back and they said, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, its gates have been burned with fire. He says there in verse 4, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And then I said, in fact, he says a lot, but skip down to verse 11, Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant, Nehemiah, and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. And the man was the king of Persia. And he goes on to say there at the end of verse 11, I was his cupbearer. And so he had access. In fact, because of his position, he had access to things no other Jewish man had access to. He had access to the king's forest for the timber to rebuild the walls. He had access to the Persian treasury because of his connection to the king. He was able to glean the resources that would be required to accomplish this great mission. You see, in the ancient world, the wall around a city represented the ability of the deity to protect the people who lived there. And that was the way people felt. And so all of the people groups living around the city of Jerusalem would mock the Jewish God because he couldn't even keep his walls intact. It was evidence that he was not the kind of a God who had power or influence, or else the walls would have been restored by now. By definition, leadership challenges the status quo. I know that's a blank you need to fill in. Now, why is that significant? Because we're all addicted to the status quo. We all are comfortable. And even in our difficulties, at times we're used to them. And so we're even comfortable with our difficulties because we're afraid if there's a challenge to the status quo, those difficulties might become greater difficulties. So let's just keep things simple. Let's just keep things as they are. And here God calls on Nehemiah to change the way things are. And immediately there's resistance. In fact, you could say the second requirement for successful leadership is, ironically enough, people to push back against your leadership. Number one, you got a problem that needs to be solved. And number two, you have a resistance to solving the problem. And certainly Nehemiah had his share of opposition. And you've read about Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, these regional provincial governors who served the Persian king. Ironically, in exactly the same capacity that now Nehemiah is going to serve the Persian king. Because Nehemiah is going to be appointed a governor for Judah. And so his peers in that region, his contemporaries, you know, they're very comfortable with the way things are with the walls of Jerusalem being still in ruins. And Nehemiah shows up and he says, we're putting the walls back up. And these guys have issues with that because now it's a threat to them. There are a ton of different issues orbiting around this story of Nehemiah. And a lot of leadership qualities we could zero in on. But the reason I selected his ability to figure out what the real problem is because if you're careful as a leader, you can address a lot of issues that don't have anything to do with resolving the problem at hand. And since everybody usually has a different opinion about what the problem is, we'll see it in the story. They all say, well, the problem, Nehemiah, is this. And Nehemiah hears all of these opinions. And then he has to decide, well, who's right? Or maybe none of them are right. In which case, it's up to who to make a decision? The leader. Seeing through the smoke of opinions and trying to figure out where to apply your assets, where to apply your energies to resolve the problem. And this is the problem. By the time we get to chapter 5, which is what we'll get to in a minute, so you can kind of flip over to chapter 5. But by the time we get to chapter 5, Nehemiah now is on site. He's got all these teams rebuilding the wall, but the building process is bogging down. The walls are not going up like they should be going up. And because Nehemiah is in charge, he says, now what is keeping us from accomplishing this incredibly important task that God has called us to accomplish? And he needs to figure out what the issue is. And he does, and you'll see that today. You know, during the initial phase of the Iraqi war, the Bush administration spent an awful lot of political capital trying to solve a problem that it turns out didn't exist. Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. And if you remember a few years ago how that all played out, even with the United Nations, it eventually became somewhat of an embarrassment to the president. And I just want you to know, I'm a big fan of George Bush. I mean, if you ask me the question, you know, who could you have lunch with, a public figure you could have lunch with, he'd probably make my top 3 list. I think I'd like to have lunch with Billy Graham before he goes home to be with the Lord. And George Bush right up there. So I love that guy, and I respect him. And everybody thought Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. I mean, the best intelligence agencies around the world, not just our guys, told the president that. Saddam Hussein had been guilty of using WMD on his own people in the past. I mean, I thought he had it. You thought he had it. Everybody thought he had it. But by the time they got around to looking for it, they couldn't find it. And when it became clear that there were essentially no WMD in Iraq to discover, the president's approval rating took a hit. And again, I'm not being critical of the president. I'm just elevating the principle that we're trying to share today. It is the responsibility of leadership to be able to understand the problem before he or she initiates a process of resolution. And if you miss the problem, it's going to cost you politically or personally. And so I hope you can understand this, especially on this Memorial Day weekend. I'm not taking shots at the president. I'm just stating a fact about leadership. Nehemiah was given, if you read the story, he's given a contingent of Persian cavalry to escort him to Jerusalem. I mean, the king really loved Nehemiah, and he wanted him to be protected. He wanted him to be successful, and he sent a military escort. Nehemiah could have employed the military escort to simply hold everybody off, you know, away from the city of Jerusalem, and he could have then even used forced labor to build the walls to protect the Jewish people from the Gentiles living in the region. He could have sought a military resolution. Nehemiah could have. But if he had used that tact in this context, he wouldn't have solved the problem. In fact, we see now in chapter 5, verse 1. Look over. This is really interesting to me. So Nehemiah is trying to figure out, why are the walls not going up quick enough? And the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. And some were saying, we and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain. Others were saying, we're mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine. That's a significant statement. We'll see in a minute why that is. Verse number 4, still others were saying, we've had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we're the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others. Okay, now this is the fascinating part to me. All leaders have to deal with criticism. All leaders have to deal with opposition. But it's not always the outsiders who are giving you a bad time. It's not always the Sanballats and the Tobiahs and the Geshems. It's not the other regional governors that are like, you know, clamoring and bringing this resistance against what you're trying to accomplish. Remember what Jesus said to the Jewish leaders hundreds of years later. It wasn't the pagans who killed the prophets, you guys did. It wasn't the Gentiles who stifled the work of God, but rebellion within the Jewish nation. That's the way it's always been, unfortunately. Unfortunately. Most families are blown apart not because one or the other of the parents are killed. Families, for the most part, are blown apart because of irreconcilable what? Differences between them. I think of churches, because that's, you know, an arena that I'm operating in all the time. And I think of churches that blow up. And I don't mean literally. Thankfully, we have the kind of freedom and protection that we can worship safely. But when I say blow up, I mean they're not relevant anymore. Churches that just a few decades ago were some of the hottest churches in America, doing the work of God. And now they're completely irrelevant in their communities. And it's not because the community rose up against them. It's not because, you know, the liberals in city council began to kind of push against what they were wanting to do in the name of Jesus. It's not the outsiders, you guys, that causes problems. It's because of our pettiness with one another. We can't get along with one another. And because of that, churches split. Because of that, new denominations are formed regularly. And what we become to the media, what we become, especially to this culture living in real time, this is the digital age, none of that happens under the radar screen. And we become a caricature of what the church is supposed to be. You know what the church is, unfortunately, in many communities? A cartoon to watch on Saturday mornings. And it's sad. And greed always seems to be the linchpin. Greed for resources or greed for control. See. According to the first chapter of Ezra, the initial waves of Jewish returnees left Persia with a lot of money. In fact, if you read that passage, as you have or will, I trust, you'll see that the king actually makes a decree. When the now Jewish people living in exile in Persia are going to return to Jerusalem, the Persian king says, now, we want you to give them parting gifts. We want you to give them livestock. We want you to give them out of your personal wealth as gifts to send them home. And so many of these Jews return home extremely wealthy. In fact, the king even opened the Persian treasury to return the valuable articles that Nebuchadnezzar had originally ransacked the Jewish temple and taken with him to Babylon. Now the Persian king is saying, you can even take that wealth back. And now we have Nehemiah showing up. And this wealthy aristocracy had developed just in the short time between Ezra showing up and Nehemiah showing up. We've got this money war going on among the Jewish people. And you got the wealthy on the one hand, and then on the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum, you got the impoverished. And so Nehemiah's trying to figure out why the walls aren't going up. And he asks opinions, and we read the opinions. Everybody has a different opinion. And they are blaming. It's the way it always is. When you ask an opinion, there's always somebody they say we can blame for the problem. Number one, let's blame God. Some of them, as you read, blame God. It was the famine. We had to over-mortgage ourselves during the famine. How many times does that happen when there's a problem in our lives, the first guy that takes the fall is God? Well, God, it's your fault because, and our theology actually is pretty accurate, you could have prevented this. Well, I can't argue with the logic. But maybe there's a reason he didn't. And the ones that were blaming God were blaming the government. They said we had to borrow money to pay the king's tax. History actually teaches us that the Persian tax system, tax structure, was not that burdensome. But people, got to blame somebody. Got to blame God, got to blame the government. It's always God's fault, always the government's fault. But where was the real problem? Within the family. You don't have to look out the window to figure out what's wrong. You got to look in the mirror. And there were Jewish brothers creating a greater burden than either God was creating or the government was creating. And that was causing many of them to lose their farms and even lose their kids to slavery. We all have to contend with the weather, you guys. We all have to contend with taxation. But what we can do something about is the hypocrisy in our own lives, in our own churches. And that's why Nehemiah is going to, you'll read in a minute, become infuriated. Because it's not the outside pressure causing the problem. The thing that was keeping the walls from being rebuilt is that the rich Jews were loaning to the poor Jews and then were taking advantage of the poor Jews' inability to pay those loans back. We talk in our conversations about rich people and poor people. But there are actually 4 classifications of people as it relates to money. Number one, you've got the righteous rich. I don't know a lot of righteously rich people. But these people have a lot, and they direct those resources under the authority of Jesus Christ. And there's nothing wrong with having stuff. It's what you do with the stuff God gives you oversight of. And the righteous rich have a lot, they give a lot. Unrighteous rich, they're wealthy, but they spend it all on themselves. In fact, we call them unrighteous not because they're non-believers. We call them unrighteous because they spend Jesus' money without consulting Jesus. And then you've got the righteous poor. They don't have much, but they're thankful for what they have. They provide for their families, have passion for the work of God. In fact, they're so busy with both of those things, they never notice that they have so much less than other people. And then you've got the unrighteous poor. And these people have an attitude of entitlement. They complain a lot. They spend what they have on themselves because they think they're life's fiscal victims. And so they have the right to spend it all on themselves. In fact, I could ask the question, which of those four categories are you in? And I'm not sure I can trust you to come up with the right answer, actually. In fact, a few years ago, I put this little line on the board. This is very profound. Sorry you guys can't see the board. You should have sat over here. But you can look on screen. Okay, this is, I don't know who this dude is. But he's the poorest guy in the whole world. And I know you feel that way at times, especially during those seasons of impoverishment when you don't have enough to pay the bills and you're thinking, oh man, is there anybody worse off than me? Woe is us. We're pitiful. And yet, this is the funny thing, and I don't mean funny in a funny actual way, interesting kind of funny. There actually is a poorest dude in the world. I don't know where he is. I don't know who he is. Probably a lot of people tied for this particular honor because it's pretty hard to have less than nothing. And so maybe there's a group here. On the other side of the spectrum, there is the richest, wealthiest individual in the world. Not really sure who that is. That changes, from week to week, depending on IPOs. But anyway, and then you've got a line, a continuum connecting the poorest dude in the world with the richest dude in the world, maybe the richest woman in the world, probably a sheik somewhere actually, I don't really know, don't really care. But you and I are on this line somewhere. We got the poorest guy, now here's the richest guy, and where are you on this line? And I know you don't know exactly, but in fact, if you had on your notes, if you drew this, go ahead, try this out. Try this at home. If you got an X for the poorest dude and an X or another one on the right side for the richest dude and a line in between, just put another X where you think you are. Okay, time's up. Now, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand because most of you are going to feel real stupid in a minute if I do. So I'm just going to say, you know what most people do? They say, well, we're probably in the middle somewhere. I mean, we're middle class. And on, some months when we're feeling a little drained, we might, be lower middle class. And then some days we're going to get a bonus or a windfall, or Uncle Fred died and he had a few bucks, and so maybe we're going to be, upper middle class. And this is the thing that I want you to understand. If you make household income, $37,000 a year before taxes are taken out, gross income. And for some of you that'd be great. For most of you that would be gross income. And this is combining your spouse, you, all the folks living under your roof, what they contribute to the fund every year. 37. If that's the case, you are right here in the top 4% of the world's wealthiest people. And just to make you feel even worse, if you make $45,000 per year, total household income, gross income, $45,000 a year, you are in the top 1% of the world's wealthiest people. Which is why it's funny that you're trying to get rich. Because you already are. And that changes the conversation. See, it's not a matter, you look at those four categories. You can take the two poor categories out because you're not. Now the only question is, are you righteously rich or unrighteously rich? And so I tell you that. Okay, anyway, I want you to watch as we continue reading chapter 5, just start to see a process here, how Nehemiah's reaction to the situation that he hears from these people parallels the life of Jehoshaphat that we talked about last weekend, if you're here last weekend, and you remember that whole sequence. First thing he does, number one, is he emotes, which means he shows Emotion. Verse 6, when I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. And when we get angry, what do we tell you with Jehoshaphat? You need to clean that up. At some point, you have to stop responding emotionally. And you got to start responding in a cognitive, logical, thoughtful way. Because when we're angry, we say things that are stupid and we do things that are stupid. Here's the stupid thing we say when we're angry. You can't possibly feel that way. That's stupid. Because obviously, the reason you're having the conversation is because they do feel that way. Another stupid line. Well, I know what I would have done. The room's very quiet right now. I just think that's so great. Here's another stupid thing to say. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Which is not accurate, because the stupidest thing you ever heard is what you just heard yourself say when you said that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Here's another stupid thing. Oh, so you think you're tired? You ever had an argument about who the most tired person in your life is? Brothers, give me a testimony right here. All right. And if you're a parent, here we go. When I was a kid. Oh, my goodness. We emote. And very quickly, what's the second step we have to take? We got to reflect. We have to take the time to reflect. And that's what he does. Look at verse 7. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials. Because he figured out, after thinking about it, where the problem actually was. What was the source of the difficulty? It was the unrighteous rich. That was the problem, the nobles and the officials. But the key is here, I pondered them. I pondered all of their opinions. Everything those guys said, I thought about it. And we need to take the time to think about it. The Hebrew word for pondering actually means to give advice to yourself. Like Jehoshaphat, Nehemiah could not allow his emotions to dictate his strategy. And good leadership takes time to reflect. Because very few crises in our lives have immediate deadlines. We don't have to resolve things like right now. And this is the principle. Principle is a very simple one. If you target everything, nobody's going to take you seriously because you're freaking out all the time. And even as parents, we had to reflect often. Because our tendency was to be over-restrictive. I think Cheryl and I would both agree that we want to be balanced, but we would tend to lean in a very restrictive way. And the kids would say, hey, Dad, can I? No. But I was just thinking, no. Hey, this weekend they're having? No. And oftentimes we'd react before we thought. We'd react before we even heard what the question was. We were saying no to something, and we didn't even know what we were saying no to. But we have that tendency at times to respond before we actually have the chance to process. And great leadership in a family, great leadership in an oikos, great leadership in a business is always to listen, to process, to understand. And you have to pick your spots. You guys, listen, there are a lot of broken things in the world. And you can't fix them all. And it's unfortunate because some of us are problem solvers and we're broken things fixers and we just want to resolve everything. And it's not our responsibility, number one, and we just can't anyway. God doesn't want us to. And we are incapable of it. See, those are two very good reasons to take a chill pill, bro. Because it isn't going to work out for you very well if you go full bore on everything. What did Nehemiah do? He sat and he pondered. He had been given a call by God to do a very specific thing. And frankly, you and I all have to overlook a lot of things you don't like in order to focus your energy and your resources on what you can change. And if you just begin to broaden your horizons and start applying your limited resources, your limited emotional power, your limited strength, your limited schedule, your limited energy everywhere, then nothing gets fixed. And that's why focus is such a key component to great leadership. And then number 3, target. target. I mean, when Nehemiah figured out what the problem was, it was like a full court press, man. I mean, he went after it. Look at the end of verse 7. I told them, you're charging your own people interest. I called together a large meeting to deal with them. Okay, we got to get together. And he said, as far as possible, we bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles, and now you're selling your own people only for them to be sold back to us. And I love the end of verse 8. They kept quiet because they couldn't find anything to say. They didn't even have a response. Why didn't they have a response? Because Nehemiah was right. And it wasn't even Nehemiah who was right. This is what great leaders do. As they ponder, as they reflect, just like Jehoshaphat, they began to look at what God said and what God did in the past. Exodus chapter 22, verse 25 says this. It's in your outline. You can't read it, just the passage. Look it up on your own time. Right now, listen to Pastor Tom. God said, if you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not treat it like a business deal. Charge no interest. All Nehemiah is doing is confronting disobedience to the Bible. That's all he's doing. You know, people could say, well, Nehemiah, you're sitting in judgment. No, he's not sitting in judgment. He's reading the Bible. This is not about Nehemiah's opinion. It's not about Nehemiah's feeling about what these guys ought to do or ought not to do. These are people who claim to love God, but evidently they love their comfort, they love their money more. And Jesus was right when he said, you can't love God and money at the same time. And that's always been true. It was the biggest problem in 500 BC in Jerusalem. It was the biggest problem in Jesus' day, and it's the biggest problem in 2012 AD in the high desert. And the greatest problems exist and continue to exist when God's people allow selfish interests to keep them from accomplishing God's purpose in the world. And as long as we're addicted to our comfort zone, we will never change the world. And so Nehemiah confronts those who are placing their own personal prosperity above the task at hand. In fact, in Deuteronomy 23:20, once again, let's just read a few passages. God said, you can charge a foreigner interest, but not a fellow Israelite, so that the Lord your God may bless you in everything you put your hand to in the land you're entering to possess. Now understand what he's saying there. He's saying if you don't charge them interest, I'll pick up the tab for the interest. God is honoring generosity. God says, don't charge them interest they can't pay. And if you take my counsel, God's speaking, you take my counsel to heart, I'll pay you interest on your mercy. And that's what God will do, because God honors kind, generous people who want to pull together. I just have to tell you, our families would be so much more powerful in terms of the impact that we provide the community, the people around us, your oikos, if you guys at home had quit squabbling with one another. Our church would be much more effective if we just dropped the pettiness label and just recognize that most of the things that bother us are back burner issues, and the front burner issues that the world would change and know Jesus. And so we need to pull together. We need to pull together resources. We need to pull together our energies. We need to pull together our focus and solve the only problem that really exists. Here's another mantra for you. Most crises aren't. They're just not. You know, 95% of the problems we're all complaining about, they're not even problems. Let me tell you what the problem is. The world's going to hell in a handbasket. That's the problem. And there's nothing, you know, people who don't know Christ can do about it. But we can. And we don't. You know, what's the biggest obstacle in your life right now? Most of you would say money. Now, you would. And that's fair, because that's what you think is true. And so I might ask you, okay, what are you going to do about it? And most people will respond, well, I'm going to get a different job that pays more money, or I'm going to get a second job to enhance income. And the question, you know, if it was a fiscal problem, I would say that's a great response. But I want to ask the question, is that the problem at all? Because if it's not the problem, then that's not good leadership. See, if the problem is a lack of resources, then maybe that's the direction you need to go. But we've already established you're in the top 1% of the world's wealthiest people. The real problem might be an addiction to our comfort. And remember, greed is never, ever, ever, ever diminished by working harder or getting more money. It's only solved through being generous. And that's why I am going to suggest that yours is not a financial problem, it's an immaturity problem. And to fix a problem, you're going to have to resolve the issue that is creating the problem. Because if you keep doing what you're doing, you keep getting what you're getting, you know. So maybe you're barking up the wrong tree. And that's the thing about leadership. Whether you're a parent who's trying to lead a family, whether you're a manager trying to lead a business, whether you're a pastor trying to lead a church, or somebody who's trying to lead an oikos. It takes somebody to stand up and see through the smoke of all the stuff that's out there and identify where the problem is. And then, man, it's like lock on to that target and commit everything you have to resolve it. It's going to take somebody to do that, and that someone is probably you. Let's pray together. Father, just give us wisdom. Oh, Lord, we need wisdom. Probably don't need money as much as we just need ideas and wisdom and growth in our hearts. So we ask that you would grant that. Help us all to be better at that. Help us all to see through whatever it is we got to see through to get to the heart of the issue. And help us to respond in an appropriate way. Everybody's head bowed and your eyes closed. Some of you might be here today and not know Christ at all. And we talk about a God who really cares for you and wants to help you and resolve issues for you and walk with you and lead you. And I just want you to know that's the God that we love and that we serve. And you can know Him in a personal way and access the divine. I mean, that is a compelling idea. If you will, ABC, admit that you can't without Christ. B, believe that Jesus is the only one who can help you. And C, make a choice. You cash in your chips right now and place them right there with Jesus. A complete commitment. Choosing to follow Christ with your life. He will save you. He will change you. He will transform the world around you. But you got to give up trying to do it your way. Admittedly, I mean, come on. Admittedly, it ain't working. If it was, you wouldn't be here. And you can pray that prayer of invitation. Even now, Lord, I admit that. I need you. I believe that you can help me. And I choose to place my faith in you right now. In Jesus' name. Amen.